As famous and successful as Taylor Swift is, I would not want to be her. And on the Tortured Poets department, I can't help but get the feeling that Taylor Swift does not necessarily want to be Taylor Swift either. She has what we call the Midas touch, doesn't she? She is the most successful and most influential musician of our time. Regardless of whether you like her or not, that is, I think, a pretty fair descriptor. I cannot think of another musician who could accurately and concisely be called the Person of the Year by Time magazine, and it seems somewhat reasonable. She combines the capacity to make people from countries around the world know her songs, like Madonna or Michael Jackson, with the capacity to make a passionate and wide-ranging number of people deeply care about her as an artist and deeply connect and resonate with her music in the same way that is reserved for singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell or Stevie Nicks. It is extremely hard to do both. Aside from the Beatles, I cannot really think of someone who is able to do both, who is able to be a world-dominating pop star and also have an immense army of people who are not just fans but devotees, who not only think the artist is good and the music catchy, but deeply adore and venerate the artist, thinking of them as a genius who will go down in the history of music and popular culture. That's a hard balance, and Taylor Swift has pulled it off. I admit that I thought Reputation would be the start of a major downswing for her after the enormous success of 1989. And I was absolutely destroyed by Swifties for saying that Reputation flopped, which at the time it kind of did, at least compared to her previous albums, which were world-conqueringly enormous. It is the only time on YouTube where I have received such a barrage of negative comments. But that speaks to the sheer depth and sheer passion of her fan army. And this group of supporters continued to care very deeply for her, and this care only grew more passionate as the years went on. Lover served to stem a lot of the bleeding she had commercially due to Reputation. Lover was not as big as it is now, but it did receive a more positive reception, and then during the pandemic, Folklore and Evermore made her a critical darling. Many people, myself included, think that those are her best albums. They made it cool to like Taylor Swift, perhaps for the first time, and they only deepened the bond that her fans felt toward her. After Midnights, and especially during the Eras tour, she exploded in popularity to an extent I didn't really think it was possible for a modern musician to achieve. She is more than an icon. She has conquered the world. She is significantly more famous than she was in 2014, and in 2014 she was the biggest pop star in the world. I don't want to make comparisons to the Beatles or the like, but I don't know what else to compare her to. There are not really a lot of neat and tidy comparisons to make for that enormous level of celebrity. And yet, the Midas touch is not necessarily a good thing now, is it? I don't know how many of you know the story of King Midas, but it's a story about someone who is eventually doomed by that power, by the power to make everything he touches turns to gold. It isolates him from the people he loves, and ultimately he is alone, desperate, and afraid of himself. He is rich beyond belief and powerful beyond constraint, and yet there is a deep sense of tragedy and isolation in the story of King Midas. And honestly, listening to the Tortured Poets Department, I think Taylor Swift is in a similar place. Do I think the new album is good? Yes, I do. I think there are a lot of songs on it I really like. But more importantly, I think it's interesting. I don't think it entirely works. I don't think it is one of her best albums. But it is an exceptionally revealing album. My 3 favorite songs on the album are But Daddy, I Love Him, I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, and Guilty as Sin. Now, normally I would not share information like that because it seems superfluous to the major points I'm making, but I think spotlighting those 3 songs is relevant because they are crazy, especially by the standards of the songs that have sustained Taylor Swift's popularity. I Can Do It With a Broken Heart is probably the most normal of these 3, and it is a song about how when she was performing at the Eras tour, so overjoyed apparently, and giving her fans such a wild, luscious spectacle, giving many people the greatest show of their lives, having the chance to see the generation's defining pop star at the peak of her power and authority and influence. She was really absolutely miserable. And that the fans constantly demanding more of her and constantly cheering and being so ecstatic was a bit of an alienating experience for her. This is quite the thing to say after mostly completing what is, by many measurements, the most successful tour of all time. Guilty as Sin is about, well, bluntly, it's about lying there, masturbating while thinking about a forgotten love, what could have been, and what perhaps will be, while in a committed relationship that has gone cold. It's extremely beautiful. It's a lovely song. It mentions Downtown Lights by the Blue Nile, which I had actually not heard before this album, and I checked it out, and it is so gorgeous. But this is not exactly what you want if you are a typical Taylor Swift fan. This is not exactly Shake It Off or Blank Space, even. This is not coy, fun, playing with her image. This is rather different. This is rather visceral. There is a draw to her, an allure in just the sheer perversity of it all, the sheer forbiddenness. She knows this great empire she has built for herself, and part of her wants to blow it all up. That does seem like the message that I get after listening to this album again and again. I do not think she consciously wants to stop being famous and successful. She has worked very hard for that success, and she deeply enjoys that her music connects with people. She likes being liked. She likes the approval of screaming fans. She likes having people there talk about how wonderful she is and how much her music has moved them. The Miss Americana documentary goes into this in great depth. But at the same time, part of her, consciously or not, is self-sabotaging. I do not know what other message you can get from this kind of thing, from including a song about how much you secretly are miserable while performing, and a song about a really filthy, beautifully filthy song about vividly touching yourself while thinking about cheating on your partner with a person that your entire fan base thinks is horrible. And that doesn't even come to But Daddy, I Love Him, which is most directly about how a large section of her fan base are a bunch of sanctimonious moralists who want to control her life, and how much she despises that. That is not a song I expected Taylor Swift to make. It is not particularly subtle. It is not particularly measured. It's draped in the style of a classic country song. Some Swift fans compared it to a grown-up version of Love Story. But it's mostly an excuse for Swift to say that the people who attempt to control her life, who believe they have a claim on determining who she dates, and who she decides to spend her time with, are basically vile. They're inane, self-aggrandizing cretins. She denounces this in extremely strong language. She literally calls them sanctimonious, which is a word I would use for them, but that's not a word to throw around lightly, especially if they are, in fact, your fans. The entire album does not paint her in a particularly positive light. Midnight's was messy, but this goes beyond messy into being outright demoniac at points. Not in a hip-hop way where you're putting on a cool front and talking about how badass you are. She seems genuinely allured by the fact that she can present herself in the worst and most lurid light possible in some of these songs. Even the titles are completely absurd, and they actively seem to go against popular appeal. My favorite song from this album is, I'll repeat it again, called But Daddy, I Love Him. Am I likely going to convince anyone to listen to the song or the album by saying, oh yes, my favorite song from it is called But Daddy, I Love Him? No, it sounds completely ridiculous. It's a reference to The Little Mermaid. She's comparing herself to a teenager who wants a forbidden love against the approval of her father. None of this makes her look particularly mature or thoughtful or like a good role model. And I like that. I like that a lot. I find that interesting. I love the messy, complicated, rather unfavorable light in which she has presented herself in the last few albums. But it's really fascinating, and this is where the Midas connection really solidified for me, that none of this seems to affect her positive appeal to the fans, even when she seems to intentionally, or at least subconsciously, be sabotaging herself. Midnights is an album where she tears off the veneers, she tears off the perceptions of elegance and morality and the idea of her as a good and thoughtful role model to present herself as a flawed, uncertain, disoriented person who is mired by self-loathing and will never be fully satisfied. The main single from that album is called Anti-Hero. It presents her as someone completely overwhelmed by doubts and misery and all these tortured thoughts that she cannot stop from overwhelming her, just saturating her mind. And that turned out to be her biggest hit in a very long time. Midnights as an album, which presents her as this flawed, complicated, desperate person who is weary of being a pop star, is what catapulted her into even greater levels of fame and success. The Tortured Poets department goes even further in that regard. It is much more actively self-loathing. It presents her as a completely manic, bizarre, desperate person who makes unlikable, often completely absurd choices again and again. The entire album being dedicated to the person the Swifties absolutely despise seems itself like an act of self-sabotage. Yes, it does not present him in the most positive light, but it does not present him in a wholly negative light, too. There are a lot of songs about how completely overwhelmed by passionate attraction she is toward him. Toward Maddie, the Satan of the Swifties. She explicitly calls out the fans multiple times. And one would think that this would damage her credibility with them. One would think that this would stop her ascension into pop stardom, into higher and higher levels of that stardom that are basically unthinkable, and that I didn't think anyone was going to reach I didn't think anyone was going to be bigger than she was in 2014, and now she's many, many times bigger. And yet it seems that no matter how darkly and miserably she presents herself, no matter how many shots she takes at snide, self-aggrandizing fans, they still eat it up. They still absolutely adore her. And yet, that does not mean they always necessarily understand this deeper, more flawed, more poignant humanity. They already have the idea in their mind of who Taylor Swift is. Any art she releases, whatever it actually says, simply reinforces that image. Whatever she touches turns to gold, and I do wonder if she is entirely happy about that. I think she deeply cares about her fans, and she deeply cares about being a pop star. But she is also in this bizarre position where she seems to almost enjoy and revel in presenting all these strange, dark, bizarre, lurid details about herself and intentionally making herself look like a bad, unlikable, miserable person. And none of it seems to affect the fans' absolute adoration for her. An absolute willingness to think of her as that grandiose, gleaming role model that she, in the text of these albums, is emphatically saying that she's not. It's a bit tragic, and that's why I think about the albums that she's released recently, this one and Midnights, as much as I do. I'm sorry if my thoughts seemed a bit diffuse. I'm working without notes this time. But I wanted to talk about all this since I think it deserves to be talked about. So anyway, tune in soon for next analysis. It will be coming soon, promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.